Well, it's 12 noon, and I believe in starting on time because your time is just as valuable as mine is. Welcome to Operations Plans and Depreciation Reports. What we're really going to talk about today is how you convert your depreciation report into an operations plan, and essentially the importance of the operations plan. An operations plan is basically a checklist and a summary of all of your obligations on an annual, biannual, quarterly basis to ensure that you've properly maintained and repaired buildings. And the cost effectiveness of this in the long run far outweighs the initial cost part of an operations plan. So we're going to walk through that step by step. Our sponsor this week is First Service Residential. Many thanks for their sponsorship, and they manage properties throughout the province. So please give them a call if you're looking for support. This webinar will be recorded. If you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A. I won't be checking the chat for any questions, but try to keep questions through the Q&A. Try to keep any questions you may have without any personal information. As this is a recorded and published webinar, we strive to protect everyone's privacy as we go through. And of course, if you have any questions as we go along, please email me additionally, and we'll be happy to have somebody respond back to you from the office. So I kind of start with the process of risk management, which is foremost on everyone's minds these days as we're renewing our insurance policies. And as we renew our insurance policies, we're finding that the increase in costs are exponential. There was a first question already, actually, which goes right to this point. And the first question is actually, council are only going to respond and act when there is a system failure. The results of that are going to be very costly for strata corporations if they result in insurance claims, losses, or damages within your buildings. It's going to get much more difficult to renew insurance if you can at all. The costs are going to exponentially grow and your deductibles are going to grow. There's absolutely no prudent decision making in doing that, and the argument that we can't afford it or it will cost us more money at this point is really a false economy, because what it will cost you today will be substantially less than if you wait for the systems to fail. And I think that's the heart of risk management. It's about forecasting and evaluating what all of your potential risks are going to be. What do you have to do to maintain and repair your property to reduce the impact of any losses? And this comes down to operations plans. Know what you own, know what you have to inspect and maintain, and renew before the component fails. We've done a number of studies through CHOA over the years on component failures and looked at things like hot water tanks, decks and balconies series, roofing systems, and every time you wait for a component in these categories to fail, if it has anything to do with water or water management, it almost always costs 30 to 50% more than had you dealt with it when it was a known maintenance and inspection and repair liability. I think you have to also look closely at the legislation. The legislation clearly says the strata corporation must repair and maintain common property and common assets. And that includes the assets of the corporation that you own, common property that has not been designated as limited common property, and limited common property, but the duty to repair and maintain it is restricted to those things that occur less than once a year. So people often ask the question, what does that mean? In a nutshell, if you have limited common property in the standard bylaws, it means that you as the owner of a strata lot have custodial maintenance. You sweep it off, you clear the drains on your decks and balconies, you may be required to shovel the snow if it's limited common property. But if it's common property, the strata cannot require you to do any maintenance. That becomes the collective responsibility of the strata. Other situation you want to look at, especially if you're in townhouses, your strata may probably include obligations in its bylaws that include repair and maintenance of part of a strata lot. If you're in an apartment building where everybody has their own hot water tank, we know the rule of hot water tanks. Owners only repair them when they fail, and it's too late. There's an insurance claim, there's an emergency call. It costs everybody a lot of money. Hot water tanks within strata lots, especially apartment buildings when everybody has their own hot water tank, is something the strata corporation should routinely maintain and inspect. And it may be something that the strata corporation is going to have take on the responsibility to routinely replace them. Replace one hot water tank in an emergency situation, hopefully with no insurance deductible, and it's going going to be $800 to $1,500 depending on access, time of day, availability, the type of tank. Do 10 or 20 tanks at the same time that are non-emergencies, and you can cut that cost down to $600 to $900. The cost savings for the community is substantial, and ultimately the money comes out of everybody's pocket. When you're dealing with your depreciation report and you're dealing with an operations plan, what you need to look at are a number of categories. What do we own? So what is all of the common property that we have to maintain and repair? And there will be a critical number of items that are not captured in your depreciation report that are maintenance items that you still need to create an inventory for. What are we responsible for? So there may be things that the Strata Corporation doesn't have designated as common property, but they may be components that you are responsible for through your bylaws. How do we plan? Here's the big $1 million question, and who's going to set this up and how do we plan is really the bigger question, because everybody looks at everyone else, well, who's going to do this? You need to either designate someone within your Strata Council. Every building will have a champion, somebody who's a retired engineer or an architect or someone in the construction industry. Even if they're not on council, ask them if they'll help you set up an operations plan. They can dedicate a fair amount of time independently. They can assemble your documents, your records, and they can really seriously help your Strata Corporation move into an operations planning system and give this information to the Strata Council. The Strata Council can then effectively set up a website, an online planning system that will essentially work. How we pay, of course, is the simple answer. It's through our Strata fees. Much easier to be paying monthly through Strata fees and long-term planning than special levies. We know special levies are always problematic. How do we govern effectively? And that really comes down to our bylaws. Do we need additional bylaws with respects to maintenance and repair? What are the consequences if we don't plan? Well, we now know the twofold consequences. The first are cost, but the second most, of course, is the risk of not being able to renew your insurance or your insurance assessments being substantially much more expensive. And then, of course, who's going to set that up is the other question that we're going to look at. So what we own, your depreciation report should capture all of the common property and common assets and those things within the bylaws that are deemed the responsibility of the Strata Corporation within one document. You should have hopefully have a summary document of what you're going to have effectively with your planning. And in your depreciation report relationship is something that is critical to get right from the beginning. One of the earlier questions that came up in an email is what happens when quotes from a depreciation report come in much higher than were projected, and I see that in the Q&A as well. It's a very good question because there are two results of that. One part is these are estimates, and the estimates themselves may be based on limited amount of information if this is just a visual report and not actually a forensic or a detailed report where there's some actual critical investigation done. So it is only an estimate, but the other part of that is, what are you asking for when you go to a depreciation planner? Are you asking them to estimate costs, including consulting and permits and inflation, up to a factor of give or take 15%? Or are they just looking at the component itself and looking for renewal costs? The additional costs of consultants, building permits, construction costs, those can easily add 15 to 30% to your cost. Likewise, the projection of costs may change dynamically if there is a supply, a demand supply problem with a certain type of project. So the report enables your community to plan for the future. This is the intention of depreciation reports. It enables us the ability to fund for the future at the same time. But it only works if you actually take it out, if you actually put a copy of it into the hands of your Strata Council, and you look at it on a routine basis through the year as part of your planning. The depreciation report is an excellent planning tool to help you build an operations plan. So here's a good example of costs and catastrophic failures and what happens when we don't plan. So it's a 38-unit apartment condo. They have 2 hot water boilers that serve the hot water in the building. They do a service and inspection annually, and their anticipation is to replace before these systems will fail. Many reasons, obviously, no insurance claim. They have a water drip tray drainage problem in their building where their drains don't actually go anywhere, and they've discovered this by default. Hot water is not disrupted, and there's a minimal risk of catastrophic failure. So they have an annual service agreement. It's $250 a year, where they have a service technician who comes in and inspects and does their basic servicing. Their replacement at 15 years, it's $7,500 each. So it's $15,000 every 2 years. And if they're replacing both of them at the same time, then their replacement costs are actually $16,250. If they're replacing just one, it's $11,250. But here's the crux of it. Like many strata corporations, their insurance deductible for water, even though they've had no claims, has now increased to $100,000. So they'd be responsible for any costs up to the $100,000 if these fail, cause a flood in the building. But likewise, if there's catastrophic failure over $100,000, they're responsible for the $100,000 claim. The difficulty with this is it also downloads to individual strata lots. So if there's a claim that only comes up to 80 or 90%, the difficulty is that the damages to each of the strata lots would not be covered by the strata's insurance, and owners would then be responsible under their own homeowner policies or their own costs for restoration. So we need to look closely at really what the impact of decision making is. So what are we responsible for? We know common property identified on the strata plan and defined in the Strata Property Act, components identified in the bylaws of the strata corporation, and any other obligations that may be established under some sort of easement, a covenant, or airspace parcel agreements. So this can also include multiple strata corporations who share common amenities like a swimming pool and a clubhouse or other types of items like this at the same time. So we have to look closely at Section 1 of the definitions in the Act. This is common property. And I think what happens is many strata corporations just don't grasp that the Act has quite a lot of potent information that's important to understand. But common property is all of those parts on the strata plan that is not part of a strata lot. So even though something on your strata plan doesn't say common property, if it's not part of the strata lot, it's automatically common property. All of the pipes, wires, ducts, every cabling, venting, anything like this, if they're located within a floor, wall, or ceiling, that's a boundary between a strata lot. So, floor ceiling between 2 strata lots, between strata lot and common property, which is the exterior of the building or a hallway, or between a strata lot or common property and another parcel of land. So this could be a strata lot and another parcel of land and an airspace parcel. And then, of course, wholly or partially within a strata lot, if they're capable and intended to be used in connection with the enjoyment of another strata lot. And what this section refers to is wholly within a strata lot, if in conjunction, these are going to be often things like hydronic heating and cooling systems. If they are multi-use through multiple sectors, they're also part of your responsibility to maintain and repair. So just in a nutshell, there's where we get our definition and our inventory out of all of our systems. So how do we plan? The best place in any case is always an inventory of all of your common property and bylaw components. This is how you create an operations planning chart. And I'm going to show you a very simple chart system in a second, which we're going to post to the website. Operations planning charts are a critical part of decision making. I think one of the easy things for budget planning each year, strata councils get together a month or two before their AGM. They look at last year's budget and the financials. They say, you know what, we did a pretty good job this year. We're on budget. We don't need to increase strata fees, or our insurance has gone up. We're going to have to increase by 22% to cover the cost. But that's the extent of the budget planning. That isn't going to provide you with the funds that you need to properly maintain and repair your buildings. And that's one of the challenges why we end up with residual risks in buildings that become so critical. in the past 6 months, and this may be part and parcel because people are at home so much, we've seen a substantial increase in sewer backups in units. Sewer backups are generally a cause of the drain clearouts in the buildings not routinely being flushed. Drain clearouts in buildings, especially apartment buildings and high rises, minimum once every 3 years if you're monitoring it, and perhaps more frequently if the conditions require. But of the backups that we've seen with sewer backups in the buildings over the last couple of months, most of the buildings are not doing drain clearouts at all in their buildings. This is a critical function to do because it affects your risks with respect to insurance. It affects the safety within the building. Drain backups result in gray water or black water, depending on where they've come from. They are a health risk, and not to mention that sewer backups, depending on homeowner policies, oftentimes are not covered under homeowner insurance policies unless owners have specifically requested that coverage for the purpose of their strata lot and any betterments in their units. So, a planning chart is really essential when you're looking at this. So I've taken this planning chart off of an 88-unit apartment building in North Vancouver. This is their current age of their building is 10 years old. Their renewal dates for a number of the projects are down the left-hand side as you're looking through the chart. I posted this as an Excel document to the website, so you'll be able to download it later and use it for your own strata. This is a summary in general categories of the kind of things that they have an obligation for and what they're dealing with. But we've basically categorized it into a series of things that require routine servicing, maintenance, and inspection. Just because the decks and the balconies, you've had no reports of leaks, and your building's 10 years old, doesn't mean they shouldn't be inspected annually. A small leak or a small tear in a deck membrane or a seam break can cause tens of thousands of dollars of damage within a 1 year period if the water is getting into the building envelope system. So you need to, these are simple things that are part of annual inspections. I've populated it in such a way that we've allocated how much the budget allocation is. So we can see when we're budgeting for the annual budget as well, how frequently that the system is serviced and inspected. Who does the service agreement or the inspection, who schedules it, but more important, the budget allocation. How much should we budget or allocate for this each year? It will differ depending on your building, depending on the technicians or the service suppliers you use. It differs depending on the quantity or the number of units that have to be inspected. But we find that preemptive inspections that happen on an annual basis are oftentimes very easy to put into your annual budget. They get done on a routine basis. You also have a very good level of evidence for your insurance provider. When's the last time you cleaned the drain clearouts were done? When was the last time the whole hot and cold water systems were inspected? When was the last time that the roofing system was inspected? All of these are concerns for insurance providers, but they're also concerns for your owners. If you wait till they fail, they will simply cost you substantially more money. This chart for this Strata Corporation also gets published as part of the annual report. So the owners, when we come to the annual meeting, the Strata Corporation publishes this chart, and the owners have evidence of how the Strata Corporation came up with the money. A very common question, I know that Daryl and I attend a lot of annual meetings. A common question everybody comes up with is, the repair and maintenance item says $60,000. What is that for? And in most cases, the Strata Corporation really don't have an answer. They might have general information, but they put the money in because that's what they've traditionally always had. It's helped to serve the Strata Corporation, but the difficulty is no one has really focused on what really should be done. And therein lies some of the challenges for the Strata Corporation. So as we go through this, we look at the roofing and the drainage system. It's 10 years old. Its projected renewal is 2028. What that tells me is by probably about 2024, 25, in addition to annual inspections, we're going to probably start some sort of renewal process for the roof. We will have an annual inspection. We've hired a roofing company. They can give us a good idea about when the roofing system itself is probably likely needing a renewal. Don't wait till you have damages from a roof. The deck repairs, the material costs, damages to the building and insulation systems, condensation damage, all these types of things will just simply compound the cost for the Strata Corporation. We know our projected cost is 2028. We have an annual service contract which costs us $800 to do an inspection. The inspections, by the way, on roofing, that's about the right price for a lot of mid-sized, smaller roofing. The inspections are critical because the inspectors will not only look for problems with the roof, they'll also look for defects and deficiencies that can be easily remedied, which also helps to extend the life of your roof. Another cost savings that people look at. Doors, windows, and skylights. Again, we've got a cycle. The current age is 10 years, projected renewal date of 2035. It's a significant cost. They do spend $2,000 a year to have the building envelope of doors, windows, and skylights inspected. And it's been very good for them because it's been very preemptive to solve problems, especially with the skylights that have arisen over the years. Their sealants and their caulking around the doors, the windows, the sealants around decks, balconies, and patio doors. These don't have a long life cycle to them. Generally about every 7 years. They have not done it yet. It's scheduled and being done this year in 2020, and their projected cost was $10,000. That's a contingency expense. Their decks and balconies are scheduled for 2022. They've done additional sealants and maintenance work every year on the decks and the balconies, but you'll see over in the right-hand column that it's projected contingency expense for 2022. All of these things together start to build a very nice picture for you between what do we do annually, what's a projected contingency expense, and what are items that are critical. I don't think there's anything on this list I would leave out or say is not critical, and let's just wait till it fails, because we know that failures cost substantially more money than proactive or preemptive maintenance and repairs. Sanitation and drainage down on the bottom row. This is the cleanouts on the drain system, a minimum once every 3 years. But really, you know, unfortunately, many strata corporations haven't done it in 10 years or more, or have never done it. But my recommendation is every 3 years minimum, if not more frequently if you're having issues. But if you have not been doing drain clear outs in your building, and your building and owners experience sewer backups within their units, you also expose your strata corporation to the liability of that cost. An owner can take an action with the CRT because the strata corporation are not maintaining and repairing their buildings. So again, these are preemptive for a whole bunch of reasons. It saves money in the long term. It's beneficial with respects to disruptions of owners. It's much better for the health of everybody in the building. It's much better for insurance renewals. As you go to insurance renewals, you have evidence of routine maintenance, inspections, and repairs. And it's preemptive in the sense that you can avoid CRT claims because you're not repairing your buildings. I like checklists. It's like going grocery shopping, anybody who does it. If you go without a checklist, you end up buying a whole bunch of things you don't need and forgetting the things you really need, which is incredibly irritating. Checklists are the same thing. Have we maintained and inspected those components that need to be done? Have we budgeted for these types of components? Do we actually have an itemized list that we can work with? And then, of course, the most important thing about a checklist, you actually have a method of verifying the work is actually being done. It's not just a list you've created to make it look good, but at the end of the year, you can look at this and say, okay, we've done 8 out of 10 of the items this year. One of the difficulties with the pandemic and with access to people's strata lots and the restrictions is that certain types of things have been pushed away. So again, drain cleanouts within buildings, which require that the drains need to be plugged on floors and backstopped, and you need access to strata lots. It's a pretty high protocol to allow this to happen right now. Buildings are finding they're having to wait 6 months or a year before they can get it back into their routine cycle. Inspections of strata lots, again, something that we may be delaying for the next 6 months or a year, or until we reach the other side of the pandemic. Effective governance, I think, is something that really should be looked at by most strata corporations. You need to clearly understand your procedures for operations and management. And governance is about bylaws. Is really what it is, and decision making. So how are you dealing with your bylaws in an effective manner? many townhouse complexes have adopted bylaws that deal specifically with hot water tanks, again, because of the cost associated with claims. Now that insurance deductibles have gone so high, it's unlikely that most claims of failed hot water tanks will be processed on the Strata's insurance. But even when you do file a claim and talk to the adjuster and the insurance company, what has happened is, even if the claim is not processed, you now have another risk identified on your future insurance renewals. These are going to be risks that everyone is going to have to be looking at. Homeowners need to be much more aware of what their insurance obligations are. Here's a sample binder, and this is something that Cho has been recommending for years. And you can do this either as a web portal for your Strata Council and for your owners, or you can set this up as physical binders. But it's an itemized index of the records and documents that you as a council and manager really need, and that are accessible when you're having council meetings to make decisions. I'm still amazed at the number of council meetings that we attend where there's a discussion over a bylaw issue and someone asks, well, can we let this person make the alterations that they're requesting to their strata lot? And no one at the meeting has a copy of the bylaws. I don't know how strata councils manage their affairs without a copy of your records in front of you, whether it's the registered strata plan, whether it is the insurance documents of the strata corporation, your depreciation report, your annual operations plan, and more importantly, whether it's your copy of your registered bylaws, copy of your annual meeting minutes, what was actually approved in the budget, a copy of the strata management agreement. Oftentimes strata managers are asked to do things that are not part of their agreements. What have you contracted the manager for? Look closely at your agreements and identify what that is. There may be additional costs to do some of the tasks that you're asking. Copy of council meeting minutes. And I like proactive council meeting minutes that are really action oriented. They list the event, the decision, who's going to be responsible for it, when it gets reported back to council, and then eventually it hopefully comes off the list as being accomplished. And then of course the last thing is monthly finances. There are two parts. Are we on budget? Are we exceeding budget? Do we have any financial challenges? And then the other part of my monthly financials is collections. Are we managing our collections in an effective way so that we're not having monetary shortfalls? We'll post this binder index again on the site so everybody has a copy of it. But again, our recommendation is create a website. Websites are for the purpose of the Strata Corporation that are perpetual, so that your Strata Corporation continues its ongoing operations, maintenance. All of these records and documents are available virtually to everyone. There isn't a record on this list that would not be available to owners if they were to request. And owner involvement, and the more owner education you have, you get much more support for budgets to get approved to be able to do these types of things. So here's an example of this. An owner submits a request to alter a window. They basically want to upgrade their windows because the windows are old and a lot of them have failed and the Strata has not yet scheduled to renew them. But before the Strata Council can respond, you need to look closely at the property designation. Are those windows the responsibility of the Strata Corporation or the responsibility of the Strata lot owner? That's going to be determined in your bylaws and the designation of the property. In most cases, doors and windows on the exterior are the responsibility of the Strata Corporation. So what the owner is asking for is they're asking for an alteration to common property. And the question you have to ask is, do we want to grant this alteration? Is there a risk that it may expose the Strata Corporation to other problems? Does this require any type of permitting with the type of request that's been made with respects to an alteration of common property? If this is part of our schedule in the next 1 to 3 years as a Strata Corporation, why would we grant this? Strata corporations do not have to grant alteration to common property. They may, and if we do, are we going to be asking this owner to take responsibility for any costs related to this alteration in the future? Are we exempting this owner if all of the windows are going to be replaced in the future? You know, there are just a myriad of questions. Again, all of these documents that we have within the Strata's records are critical to be able to make this type of decision. I like council decisions for tracking. So the Strata Property Act and bylaws require that council members make decisions and that general meetings are decisions. Essentially, you have an obligation to vote and then record your decisions. So set up action minutes to track decisions and deadlines. Identify in your minutes who's responsible to implement actions. It's no point to have a decision about investigating something, or council have approved the installation of a component or a maintenance item such as the drain clearing, but no one is assigned to that task with a deadline. You want to know by your next council meeting what was done, did it get done, is there a delay, are there other things that we need to do, have we scheduled this and set this up. So these are some of the things that you really need to look at. You can also identify in your minutes what budget allocations are authorized, so it's perfectly clear about the funding that's being set, and set future meeting deadlines for reporting so you can close off items. There's nothing worse than having an set of action minutes with 40 items on it and nobody's been closing them off. Keep them chronological. What's the most current on your list? Once they're completed, take them off the list and clear it up. And make sure as a Strata Council you vote on matters that require decisions. Your property manager needs lawful instructions, or a council member who's undertaking a responsibility needs to be authorized to be able to proceed with a contract or engage in an approved expense. They need you to make decisions, which are in the minutes, to make their job easier. Here's a sample of action minutes for a Strata corporation. So roof inspections. The decision was the property manager was instructed to order a roofing inspection with ABC Roofing scheduled for June of 2020. It was carried by majority vote. The cost that was allocated is $500. When we get to our next series of minutes, March, April, May, June, it'll be ongoing until this job is done, and then we'll have a small summary report. It's off the list and we move to the next part. Each one of these identifies issues that require a decision. The council, if they've made a decision, it's indicated, and if there's a cost associated with it, it's earmarked as well. It's between this and the operations plan, it's a great way to track the business of the Strata Corporation. How do we pay? And there's a question out of this that came up about depreciation reports last week. Annual operating budgets and reserve fund contributions only require a majority vote for approval. So try to avoid special levies if you can. Even if you know that 3 years from now, you're going to need an additional $120,000 for a roof, then why not contribute $40,000 a year more in your annual contingency contributions? It only requires a majority vote. And it basically means people will be contributing this over 36 months and not pressed with a special levy at the last minute, which many owners find very difficult to manage. It's much easier to manage and collect strata fees and contingency funds that are built up over a period of time than special levies. Planned service contracts and long-term renewals generally give us predictable funding, and that's what we want. We know that the roof projection is going to be $120,000. We've had a roofing assessment done with respect by a consultant. We know what the consulting costs, the engineering, everything that might be associated with the roof. We don't quite know exactly what the competitive pricing will come in at yet, because we're still at the estimate stage. But we built in a value of $120,000 with a bit of a contingency. Why are we not saving today for the next 3 years of that cycle? And we have some good planning models that certainly you could take advantage of that help with that planning cycle. The difficulty with special levies is that they're often voted down on the first round, especially if they're significant levies. And because they're voted down, the repairs and maintenance are often deferred. And we see this now with things like roofing replacement. We see this with hot and cold domestic water replacements. We see it with balcony and elevator replacements. And so the difficulty is at this time, we have a bit of a problem in the sense that we now have this increasing liability. And with this increasing liability, also we have an increasing risk around insurance losses, renewals, costs, risk of claims. And the difficulty with that is you may not be able to renew your insurance, as one of the strata corporations last week discovered, because they were given a letter from their strata corporation a year ago advising that they had to replace the roof that was well past its life expectancy as a result of a claim that occurred. A year's gone by, they've done nothing about it, and the insurance brokers have clearly advised, we cannot renew your insurance. No one will insure you because you're not managing the risks. So all of the owners in this development collectively are at risk now at the same time. And that's the problem. If you're not managing your risks and you're not managing your losses, the increased costs for collections and disputes and insurance or loss of insurance are just going to compound on the owners to make it much more difficult. The best way to pay is always through your annual operating budget, because whether it's a contingency contribution or annual operating budget, it's still only a majority vote. The other benefit, of course, is with the contingency fund, if it's a recommended repair, says nothing about value or timing, but if it's a recommended repair in the report, it's also only a majority vote to approve the contingency expenses. And we have very good examples of strata corporations who are funding well, who come to their AGM with 4 or 5 major construction projects, and they're fully funded from their contingency funds because they've been spending the time and the money. It's never too late. I know for older strata corporations, everybody says, well, geez, we're not going to be able to catch up on this and it'll cost us too much money. It will cost, but look at the next 5 years. Don't look 30 years out. That might terrify you, but look at the next 5 years each year. How much money are we going to need in the next 5 years to be able to reach our major projects without special levies? It becomes a very realistic price for owners to manage. Communication is absolutely critical, and I think with operations plans and depreciation reports, they're absolutely essential. I think part of your communication should be really around informing owners as part of an annual report. If you have an operations plan, that's a simple summary page that shows all of your annual servicing. And you have a depreciation summary, that's another page that shows you the components in the next 5 to 10 years and some values and estimates. Publish those in your annual report. It's not the information owners know about that's complicated or controversial or creates a conflict. It's what the owners don't know about that always creates the controversy and the conflict in communities. Owners are much more willing to support funding projects and moving ahead with approval of projects if they're aware and can anticipate what's coming up. This is also a really great document with respects to sellers and buyers. Strata corporations who have well-funded contingency funds, who have depreciation reports and operations plans are very attractive buildings for buyers, because a buyer can go in, a financial institution can go in, and they can clearly understand what types of risks they're going to have to be exposed to and what they're going to manage. Communication with owners is absolutely essential. So here's a little comparison. Does your building have a maintenance plan? We buy a car every 5 or 10 years. Comes with a maintenance manual, a maintenance schedule. We know we have to change the oil. We know we have to do our servicing, especially if we have a warranty. If we don't do it, the warranty is null and void. But we have all of these components that come with a car that we're probably spending somewhere between $25,000 and $50,000 for the average car. And yet we bought a condo that's worth $800,000 and we have no maintenance manual. It doesn't make any sense. The value of your condo is much greater, its future value and risks are much greater, and the preservation of your building asset is much more important than what you're doing with your 5-year cycle vehicle. And so there's a very good comparison to think about the importance of a maintenance manual for strata corporations. Any building is an eligible candidate to develop a maintenance manual, even if you don't have a depreciation report. You're a 5-plex, or you're a 10-unit bare land strata. It's still beneficial to pull together all of the documents that you need, which we've itemized, to help you maintain and repair your property. General routine maintenance items on buildings can be just as complicated on a 5-plex as they can be on a 100-unit strata, depending on the design and the structure of the buildings. 5-unit strata corporations that are 5-story buildings with elevators are common in the province. They may be 5, 8, or 10 units. Just because they're smaller developments doesn't mean they're not complicated systems to maintain and repair. Remember, your depreciation report is the framework for renewals. The maintenance manual is a complete inventory of all of your components and service requirements. And the other problem is, who does this? So do you have a volunteer on your Strata Council, someone within your building? Are you paying your property manager an additional fee to set up your maintenance manual and your operations plan? Or are you retaining a consultant for one time to set up all of these systems so that you can have a long-term system? Once the operations plan is set up, it's much easier to maintain and to sustain in the long-term process, provided your Strata Council continues to use it and engage it. Looking at building systems, we have very complicated building systems. We have complicated HVAC systems and swimming pools and backup emergency generators, our building envelope systems, our energy systems within our buildings, energy systems that are not maintained, that are not calibrated, just simply consume more energy and perform at a lower scale, which eventually costs us more money and shortens the life of the products. Again, it's cost savings in the long term if you actually manage the building components. But what's attached to your buildings? There are many things attached to things like townhouses that are component items that are the responsibility of the strata corporations. If you're in a Bearland strata, you may have electrical faults. You may have a water hydrant fire system, street lights. You may have roadways, parking areas. You might have a common amenity clubhouse, outside hose bibs in buildings that are attached to the outside of townhouse complexes are common property. They're the responsibility of the strata. There may be an interior shut-off for them, there may not. Exterior and perimeter drainage systems. You look closely at all the components of your buildings. The good question to go back and ask, who's responsible for this? If it's common property, it's a no-brainer. It's the Strata Corporation who's responsible. And the better servicing you can do will give you much better life cycle of your buildings. Governance and bylaws. Again, everybody's bylaws should be routinely reviewed. You should have bylaws that deal with insurance obligations, who's responsible in the event of a claim, who's responsible for damages, what if the amount is below the claim, what if somebody has is responsible for the claim or caused the claim, who pays the deductibles. There are a number of items that come up when you're dealing with bylaws. Bylaws can be instructive as well as regulatory. So while strata corporations cannot force owners to buy homeowner insurance, an insurance bylaw can be very clearly instructive as to why you need to have why an individual should have homeowner insurance, why landlords should have landlord insurance, and why tenants should have tenant insurance. If you were watching the interviews with the people who've been homeless as a result of the Langley fire, there's quite a number of tenants who don't have homeowner insurance or tenant insurance specifically for their coverage. They have no living out expense allocation. They've lost everything. They don't know what they're going to do. It's important that your bylaws can be instructive as well as regulatory. We know what the bylaw requirements for compliance are, and that bylaws don't override the provisions of the Act or the Human Rights Code or any other enactment of law. But people should also be routinely informed about the bylaws, especially those that impose an obligation. I doubt many owners actively have a set of bylaws in their strata lots where they can look, read, understand what they're doing. I also see bylaws that are written that are incredibly complicated. The average person can't read anyhow, and that's its own problem. But the other challenge is, do owners clearly understand what your basic bylaws are? Again, communication with owners as part of your operations plan. What's your obligation as an owner to maintain, repair, and inspect? We should be inspecting things like tub surrounds. I think I've got some of these here. You should be checking for drainage and water supplies within your buildings, that there are no leaks. You should have a bylaw requiring that all washing machines are equipped with steel braided hoses. Bylaws that deal with hot water tanks. Bylaws that deal with inspection on drains for decks, patios, balconies, and floor drains if they're within a strata lot or on limited common property. You can even request that owners routinely inspect floor drains on areas that are decks and balconies that are common property. There's no harm in providing education to the owners. The other challenge, though, is even though we're actually saying within our bylaws, you have to do all these things, we have to go back and say, can you really rely on the owners to do these inspections honestly on an annual basis? And while a good part of the owners will be cooperative and do this, there's going to be a good number who don't do it at all. And that's the challenge and the difficulty that we have, is actually engaging owners in an active way within their strata corporations. You may still be looking at setting up annual inspections of strata lots for the purpose of checking for water management. Slow leaks, things that come from items like a drain under a sink has been leaking for the last year, nobody's done anything about it. It's not an insurable claim, but if it has actually gone through the floor and into the ceiling of the unit below, and there's any type of dry rot or structural damage, you could find that type of repair can cost $10,000 or $20,000. And it's because a unit was not routinely inspected. Tub surrounds and shower tiling and shower surrounds, if they're not unified systems, are frequent problems with respects to water damages in walls, damaging other strata lots. Oftentimes the systems have to be removed to properly be repaired and replaced, and it's a significant cost for everyone. Routine inspections can really help to solve a lot of these problems. Landlords should be reminded to educate their tenants on what their obligations are. Owners need to inspect their own appliances, their refrigerators. Everybody likes a refrigerator with a water and ice maker, but oftentimes there are defects in the attachments and the couplings where they are installed that result in slow leaks. You know, think about things like your fire safety systems. Does the strata include the inspection and maintenance of smoke detectors in strata lots as part of the routine schedule of the fire safety inspections? Oftentimes these are battery operated, they're not hardwired into the unit, and they're not the responsibility of the strata. But the strata, when they're doing heat inspections for heat detectors, may actually be looking at that. Landlords, look at your building systems, the plumbing systems in the building, see if they're identified. An annual survey could help with owners. And then of course the other thing with bylaws is, while you can't force people into this, always recommend as part of your annual report that you send to owners that homeowners provide their information. Just a little humor to round off. And this has certainly occurred, which is less humorous, I guess. But it's important to remember that your strata council members are volunteers and they're not operational experts. We expect our strata councils to solve all of our problems, and for the most part, as a group of individuals, they bring a lot of information and experience, but budget for professional services when you need them, so you have the right people and the right resources to make the best decisions. The comparison that I go back to frequently is roofing and re-roofing of buildings. Someone on Strata Council says, well, I have a friend who's a roofer and let's get 3 quotes. Well, you get 3 quotes without any specifications, and the difficulty is the quotes mean absolutely nothing because 3 of them are not bidding on the same conditions. No one is going to inspect the job to make sure that it was done properly. There was no competitive bidding or pricing. I've been responsible for roofing on a project in the last year, and I have to say that my experience has been, the moment we went to a technical specification with an inspector, did bidding, the price dropped by almost 50% over the original quotes that we had that had nothing to do with any type of technical information. So, this fear that if you go to an inspector and actually bid for the roof is going to cost you more is not true. It just ensures you get what you pay for. Someone has inspected it. You, the Strata Corporation, are protected, and all of the bids are competitive on the same purposes. So I'm going to jump now up into the Q&A and have a quick scan of some of the questions. One of the questions that came up from the last week's session on depreciation reports has to do with Strata corporations who take some of their depreciation items and put them in their operating budgets. So we have a Strata corporation with 7 buildings, and every year in their operating budget, they allocate enough money, it's designated, they repaint the hallways of the common areas of the building. And so they do that on cycle. Can they do that? Absolutely, you can do that. What will show up in your depreciation report is that, that the painting of the interior areas may have a specific value to it, but that value is deferred to the annual operating budget, and that it is an item that the Strata Corporation performs on an annual basis, building by building and cycle. How it's expensed or how it's allocated isn't as critical as disclosing when it's done, how it's done on cycle. The Act says that the annual operating budget is for those items that occur once a year or more frequently. And if you're doing a cycle of painting or maintenance or carpet renewals or decks and balconies, maybe you're doing one balcony, one deck every year, slowly working your way through the building as you're doing your upgrades. That may not be enough money, by the way, because you probably are going to have to be doing 10 or 20 at a time. But if you have a cycle where you're doing these types of repairs and you've allocated this amount within your annual budget, you certainly can do that. It's just reported in both places. Another question that came up is how do you attract enough owners to the Strata Council to get people to make up an operations plan? Well, this is a communication issue. I find that in buildings where there's a higher level of communication, that you do have people that are more interested. Where there's a higher level of communication, an operations plan and good funding, there tend to be a lot fewer conflicts as well. You know, just remember Strata Councils are extended families, and what in every family fights about money or the lack of money. And this is one of the challenges in many Strata corporations. Financial hardships and financial restrictions really do create problems for communities. Operations planning, depreciation reports, good budgeting, and communications with the owners all come together to make buildings much more functional as you're going forward. The other thing is you don't need to be a council member to be able to attract people to your to do work for you. I think that's one of the misconceptions. Oftentimes you'll have retired professionals in the building who don't want to be on Strata Council, but they're quite willing to do single tasks. Approach them and get them to help you out. Within the standard bylaws, Strata Councils can create committees. Committees don't have to be council members. We see them on gardening and landscape committees. We see them on building renewal committees, building envelope committees, maintenance programs. They do occur frequently. If you create a committee, what you want to do is you want to clearly define what the role of the committee is, if they have any authority, and who they report to. So for this purpose, you might have a committee of 2 or 3 people to create an operations plan, and they report this information back to the Strata Council, which will be used for implementing in the budgeting. You know, once you've populated your operations plan for the first time, it's much easier to maintain it over the longer time. So what's the financial responsibility of an owner for their limited common property, such as a solarium, versus the Strata responsibility? And is the Strata responsible for all the repairs other than maintenance and cleaning? This depends on your bylaws. If you have limited common property, you are permitted as a Strata to make an owner responsible for the maintenance and repair of limited common property. You can amend the bylaw so that the bylaw can impose greater responsibilities. Again, this comes back to what type of responsibilities or bylaws do we need to ensure that our properties are well maintained and inspected. It's not always a smart idea to delegate more responsibility for owners that they're just going to ignore and not do anything about, and leave you with a building disaster anyhow. That's one of the challenges as you go through that. What's really the best interest? I don't think anyone would ever agree that in a building, making owners responsible to maintain and repair windows on the exterior of an apartment building is responsible. They can't access them. It's a safety risk. They're not qualified to do it. And 99% of the time, they just don't do it anyhow, resulting in building envelope problems. There are no benefits to making owners responsible for components that they simply don't have the capacity to deal with. Our bathroom fans, common property, you need to look at your Strata Corporation's Strata plan and your bylaws, but generally no. Bathroom fans are oftentimes part of the Strata lot unless within your Strata plan or your definitions of common property, they meet that test. Bathroom fans are an appliance or like an appliance and an electrical service served solely off of your electrical system within your unit. And they're the responsibility of owners. However, bathroom fans and kitchen fans are a part of the interior air quality and the ventilation within units, and they should be looked at frequently, because if they're not operational, you will have buildup of moisture within units and you will have a probability of mold, which really comes into a greater problem. I figured we were going to see a bunch of these questions now about is an air conditioner on the outside wall on a deck, whose responsibility of it is. We don't know the answer to that question without looking closely at your strata plan, without looking at your bylaws, and also knowing the history of how these air conditioners were installed and who was responsible for them and what history the strata has. So if the developer has installed air conditioners that are exposed to outer deck areas, and it turns out that the Strata Corporation has been maintaining them for the last 10 years, it's likely that the Strata Corporation is probably going to have a responsibility to continue to do that. If the Strata Corporation is not going to continue to do that, you probably want to look at a bylaw to determine what the property, how the property is designated, and how the allocation of responsibility is set up for the owners. This is the same as heat pumps that are located outside of strata lots. What's the responsibility? The heat pump, is the heat pump actually on common property? Is it on part of a strata lot? Is it limited common property? At the time the strata plans were created, no one really thought about what the implications of that were. But 10 or 15 years down the road, when the heat pumps need to be serviced or replaced or upgraded, this is where there starts to be a lot of confusion. So try to clear that up through your bylaws. But of course, the first step is always determine what kind of property it's designated on. There isn't a black and white answer for a lot of these questions. We oftentimes have to look closely at the history of what happened, and oftentimes it requires a legal opinion based upon case law and based upon CRT decisions as to who's responsible for certain obligations around these types of things. How does the Strata Corporation deal with lateral sewer pipes within the wall from each strata lot? There are cleanouts within the buildings themselves. They exist within certain designated areas that you'll find them. Sometimes they're oriented under the sinks of units. Sometimes you will have clear out lines that are on each floor that are easily accessible. Every building is different, but until the building's drainage systems and sanitary systems are cleared out, there is a constant risk of sewer backups, which is a problem for every strata corporation as they go through this. And you don't have to take notes, because this session is going to be posted to the website. So you can just go back and look at this session again. They're all recorded, they're all posted, all the information and the slides and everything are posted there as well. If an owner is given permission to install a window, does it become common property like other owners? Well, it's a great question, because doors and windows are a significant issue. With respects to doors and windows on the exterior of the building, they form part of the wall. They're pretty much always common property. And taking and installing one component on common property over what was another area on common property doesn't change the property designation. So if somebody requests a skylight in their townhouse and they get permission to install the skylight, just because they put in a skylight doesn't mean it's part of their strata lot. If it's on common property, it continues to be common property. And it's always better for the Strata Corporation to maintain, repair, and inspect common property. Now, when they've been given permission to install the window, they may have also had to sign an agreement that they'll be responsible for any cost related to maintenance or repair or renewal of the skylight. And you need to get legal advice on these relationships, because they don't run with the land. The agreement is with the individual. So unless if the person sells their strata lot, unless that person compels the new buyer into that agreement, you may have enforceability issues with that agreement, even though you may have disclosed it on a Form B information certificate as part of the obligations of the unit. So when you're doing these types of alterations to common property, get legal advice on what that agreement and that arrangement needs to look like. And that's an expense that the person who's requesting the alteration should be expected to pay for. It becomes a condition of the alteration if the strata agrees to it. Also, try to schedule things like alterations to common property, especially if it's roofing. Try to schedule them so that they coincide with new roofing systems. That way there you have the least risk of jeopardizing warranties or other conditions of the roofing systems. And I think we're pretty much through most of the questions. A whole bunch of them are kind of kind of repeats. So I'm just going to invite you. So thanks for joining us today. I'm just going to invite you to join us next week. Jennifer Neville from Hamilton and Company, she and I are going to talk about managing alteration requests for strata lots. So it kind of falls out of this, and the importance of dealing with looking at those types of relationships. This video, along with the different guides that I referred to in the presentation, will be posted to the website later today. You can access it, share it with anybody that you wish. Certainly they will enjoy it. Thanks again for First Service Residential for sponsoring today's event, and many thanks for BC Housing and their staff for all the amazing work that they do, especially is with public education, with research guides, the building excellence programs, and all of the other resources that they provide for multifamily housing for the public. So thanks so much everyone today, and we'll see you again soon.